Bam.
This is Ilana Redstone, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, we got Ilana here. She's going to talk about, this is going to be great. Will, who's below me. Hey, Will, welcome to the show. I guess, you know what? I'm going to let Will introduce you and let Will do the talking, and then I'm going to shut up and we'll jump in a minute. Go ahead, Will.
Wait, what? Okay, so, yeah, I mean, glad to be
myself,
here.
Will, if you're totally on the spot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm pretty, I can flex with it, I guess, but I am Wilred Reilly, of course. Glad to be here on the Break It Down show with my good buddy, Pete Turner. And today's interviewee is Ilana Redstone, who I know primarily from her work with the University of Austin and me own University of Illinois. But I'll actually let Ilana do her intro clip. However you'd like to introduce yourself. What would that be?
So I'm primarily a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, but I also co-direct the Mill Institute at the University of Austin, formerly UATX. And Will and I met in person last June, I guess, at an event in the Bronx that he was furiously running late for. But my work is primarily, it sort of fits into this broad area under political polarization, civil discourse, viewpoint diversity, et cetera, all of this stuff. But I sort of view those as kind of downstream consequences of a fundamental problem in how we think. So the book, The Certainty Trap, will be out in September. And then I'm working on another book right now, which is sort of under the same sort of broad themes. But yeah, so I guess that would be the potted summary.
A lot of these issues are social issues, and we struggle to deal with these things. One of my guesses is that these are ancient problems that we try to solve, and there's just no solving them. There's always going to be some degree of misery and being left behindness and inequity. I mean, these are Grecian problems, these are Babylonian problems. And then we disagree on them, and then we tend to exacerbate what's there and make them worse. Is that in any way inaccurate? Would you say, Pete, you're crazy? Of course we can get better at this. Of course we've got modern technology, and we can do a better job of balancing things out.
Well, I don't know you well enough to know if you're crazy, but nothing that you said so far sounds crazy to me. I guess what I would, sometimes I'll get the question of, why should anyone, basically, if I'm telling people that we need to all question our thinking, both question and clarify our thinking, I'm sort of asking people to do the thing that they don't want to do. And so sometimes I'll get the question of, well, why would I want to do this yucky thing that you're asking me to do? And the reason is because it actually has direct implications for democracy, which is something that is certainly a topic of conversation that we are, there's certainly polls that show that people on all sides of the political spectrum have concerns about that, although they're not the same concerns. But here's where I would start. I would say that democracy, one of the things that we've forgotten somewhere along the way, is that democracy is rooted in the principle that we see one another as fundamentally capable of reasonable thought. And if we get to the point where it's, half the country is racist or stupid or libtard, whatever it is, then there's a choice to make, right? If that's quite literally your conviction, then you can choose between either democracy is not the mechanism that you want, or it's time to sort of question some of the assumptions that you're making about people who disagree with you. I happen to be a fan of democracy, so I'm hoping that we land at the latter, not the former. But it's both a process of questioning and again being much more precise in the ways that we think about particularly heated and contentious issues and how we disagree. And those are all really doable things. They're just not things that people want to do.
So One question, I guess, that a lot of people ask in political science and a number of other fields is why polarization seems to have increased so dramatically in the recent past. And I mean, there are a bunch of studies showing this, that the median Democrat and Republican have moved much further apart than they used to be. There's a great deal of tension, the big sort in society, all that. Why is this happening?
Yeah. Oh, God, that's a big question. Yes. The answer is 5. Why is it happening? So many reasons, right? Like, so you can imagine there's an idea that, sorry, I'm just trying to think where to start. I mean, right. So one of the things people will point to obviously is social media and sort of the role of social media. And then people will argue about sort of, is it just kind of reinforcing political polarization, or is it actually making it worse? But there's clearly the role of social media. I do think that there's a pretty, in what you just described, Will, I think there's a pretty powerful feedback loop, right? So I'm not, it's sort of a little bit of a dodge of the question. You asked where did it start, but I mean, and what I'm pointing to is the feedback loop. People will throw out ideas like it has everything, it comes from having a long period of peace, right? Largely of a long peaceful period where we have no external enemy that right? Is that true? Is that exactly, other people will point to it's Newt Gingrich, and it's the fact that, senators no longer spend time socializing in DC, going back, right? So going back to when he was Speaker of the House. Is it any one of these things? Probably not. Is it all over? I mean, Francis Fukuyama has written a bunch of, I'm sure you've read, like, he's written a lot of interesting pieces about this. I do think it's also just, I think that we are fighting against a very natural and human desire to simplify information. And it just, and like, we like categories. We like categories. We like simple, we like to be able to put things in boxes. And when it comes to issues around whatever it is, race, gender, immigration, frankly, the Israeli-Gaza war, like all of these things, they really don't fit neatly in boxes. And if you think that they do, then that's a completely different. Let me just give you an example. Like, I went to a discussion group a couple of weeks ago. I was actually just there as a participant, but it was led by some physics graduate students at the U of I, and they were just interested in having controversial discussions about controversial things. So I just went as a participant. And at one point, and there were people there who were sort of stridently pro-Palestinian and stridently pro-Israel. And as in most of these settings, there's sort of a couple of people who tend to dominate in terms of the talking. But one of them was saying, there was a student there who said something to the effect of, can we just admit that this is, can we just all admit finally that this is not a targeted attack on Hamas, right? Like, this was his position, which, again, like, I'm fine with all kind, like, I can, like, the whole point of this was a discussion. But my point was, I said, one of the few things I said during that conversation is I said, well, okay, if that's actually how you see it, first of all, what if you're wrong, right? Like, and then, but secondly, if that's how you see it, if you see, because what they led to a question about, do you believe that this situation or any other contentious issue is fundamentally morally and ethically complicated? And this student said no. And maybe it might have been a different student in the group, but it was part of the same conversation. And if that's your starting point, then you're already starting from, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. Like, this is a Marvel movie. And I think there are good reasons to think that's actually not how it works. And not only that, but it's dangerous, that it's a dangerous way to think. And in fact, sorry, I'll add one more point. Like, a lot of people, one of the questions that will come up is, sort of the more extreme examples, right? So like, well, what does this mean? Does this mean you're both siding something like slavery or the Holocaust or whatever, right? But it's actually not the way it works at all, because what happens is that the more moral clarity that we have, the less contentious something becomes, the clearer the principle is that's being violated. So for example, with slavery, it's not hard to say all lives have equal moral value, or no human being should imprison and should enslave another, right? Like, it's not, and so, like, someone can argue with me about those principles, but I can name them very clearly what they are. So but what is the principle that's being violated if someone says, I don't think that trans women should be allowed to participate in women's category sports? What is the corresponding thing that, like, what is the rule that's being broken? I don't know. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it
One of
makes
the
very good sense. I mean, if I could just make one quick comment. I mean, I actually would say from a legal background, the claim would be that the principle that's being violated is the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection. But that rests on a
Which
bunch of
example,
claims.
Will? Which example? You're talking about slavery? You're talking about
Oh
the
no, the trans
yeah.
women, quote unquote, thing. I mean, like the argument would be that gender identity and sexual orientation have been or should be added in practice to the civil rights category. So you're
Yeah.
denying trans women, who of course are women, the ability to compete with other women in
Yeah.
women's sprinting. And I mean, I think that the reaction of most people to that would be, and my comment, I joke about being an amoral businessman. But I mean, every time people have these kind of conversations, to me, it sounds kind of like discussing how tall Hercules was, because we just made all of these rules up. So I mean, like you couldn't explain them to wolves or lions or anything. They're mostly just
Yeah.
bullshit. They're about 10 real principles. Like, don't enslave your enemies is in the next
Right.
category under those 10, I would say. But but I mean, in the case of the trans situation, there's generally a moral principle that can be evoked, like treat people equally.
Yeah.
I find generally, as a fairly frequent debater, that the response would then get into what's actually meant there. Like, should you treat people equally even if they're not equal? But yeah, I mean
Not be equal. Yeah. What equal on what? Equal by what standard? Equal in terms of what? Like attractiveness,
equally.
intelligence, wealth. Like what?
Oh no, I don't mean to be glib. I'm just saying in the trans case, equally female. I mean, so like the entire gender debate, I think we should be polite to mentally ill people, but the entire gender debate is the idea of large scale trans accommodations is dependent on the claim that there is a category, gender, which is made up of the stereotypes associated with sex, bluntly, that is as important and as relevant as sex when it comes to deciding who's going to be, say, an Olympic competitor. And as both a man, a former athlete, something of a feminist in the second wave sense, like I view that as existentially absurd. So, I mean, I think that that's what most people think privately. I just, I did okay before I got into college and had the luxury of being able to say it. But that is the debate there, where someone would say, well, trans women and cis women are both women, so you're proposing treating women unequally. And I think the response from smart guy on the street would be trans women are guys, so that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I guess I would. So let me back up for a second, so just respond to a couple of things. First of all, I think your point about the 14th Amendment and sort of the legal side, I mean, so look, like I guess I want to make a distinction between a lot of what I do relates, and I'm going to point to the First Amendment, not the 14th Amendment, but a lot of what I do relates, obviously, has implications for free speech and self-censorship. There are people who are far more knowledgeable, constitutional scholars who are far more knowledgeable than I am about what those arguments look like and sort of what the, time, place, and manner restrictions on the First, whatever it is, right? And so the space that I live in is really much more about we all have to live together. And so how are we in small communities, in large communities, in our families, whatever? And so how are we going to talk to one another and sort of walk away and disagree at the end of the day and not want to kill each other? So I guess I don't think it's necessarily a bright line, but I think there is somewhat of a line between kind of the legal argument, which is also important, and the sort of how do we live together knowing that agreement fundamentally isn't the goal, right? That success at the end of the day is not agreement. So I think, I think that's just, which is not in any way to undermine the importance of the legal argument. It's the other thing that I would say is that just to go back to the trans issue, for example, I'm not actually explicitly taking a position on it. What I'm saying is that when we think that all of those questions, right, you pointed to, and rightly so, a whole long list of questions and assumptions. What I'm saying is that when we treat the answers to those questions as given, it gives us all the permission that we need to sort of feel the righteous indignation and the moral outrage that generates the contempt that creates all the problems that we started out talking about.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, this is kind of funny because I disagreed with the first example, but in general, I agree with that point. Like the Marvel movie analogy is pretty good. There's a tendency among human beings in general, I find especially among guys, to divide former military friends of mine, for example, will refer to America's opponents as the bad guys. Like, we went to war against the bad guys. We had to take out some bad guys. And if you're a warrior in the field, that's completely understandable. But I mean, the first level of scholastic analysis probably would be looking at a conflict between the USA and Iran, or China and India, and saying, well, there's a lot going on here. Yeah, it's very unlikely that anyone's a stereotypical cartoon villain in most situations. So, correct. Yeah. Pete, what do you think? You were a soldier and a good one. Do you agree with this, or are there some bad guys out there? Are there a lot of simple situations?
Oh, there's for sure bad guys. I mean, I'm here to tell you, there's people that have ill intent towards a lot of people. There's no one worse
than the guy trying to kill you.
Right on cue. Right on cue. My internet's being dodgy.
I missed what you said. Say it again.
Oh, I said there's no one worse than the guy trying to kill you.
Sure.
So again, I mean, I think situationally, like, person actively shooting at you is a good shorthand proxy for enemy. Yeah. So I mean, it's natural that if you're in these situations, even in elite business competition, you're going to say, to hell with those people. We're going to destroy everything they know and love. But if you're observing from the outside, that's probably not what you're seeing. I mean, lessons from me for a while, but the most controversial thing I've said on Twitter and Facebook recently was intended as almost like a dry joking line. But I said, I'm getting the feeling that both the Israelis and the Arabs have been imperfect when it comes to negotiations. And all these people started responding and saying, you son of a bitch, how can you say that? It's clear there's a good guy here. And they were coming from both directions. So the reality is often unpopular, I think.
Sorry.
I wanted to say something about this, because a lot of this gets into ethics, and people really struggle with ethics because ethics aren't easy. Right. And if you understand ethics, you can move the camera around the battlefield in this case, and ethics get really confusing. And here's the deal with war. And I just, all respect to young people, read some books. Netanyahu put out a book less than 18 months ago, less than a year before that war happened. And if you want to have an opinion, you'd better read that man's book. This isn't just read that. If you can't speak intelligently about the dozen plus wars, how by their count, by Hamas's count, in the last 20 years, then you really don't have an informed opinion. And if you think you can boil it down to a binary response, you're absolutely wrong. There's no way to have a simple response to this. What happened is we ran out of words. And then you go to fight because both sides are trying to impose their will. And there's more than two sides in this. You have Sunnis, you have Shia. That's a political fight, not just there's really very little religion in this. And there are Sunni Shia undertones. It's all kinds of things going on. So to simply stand up and say, Palestine, river to the sea, you are just parroting someone else's talking point. And you have had an information operation run on you. That's really where this comes from. And so the ethical problem here is that you have not done your job to have this informed opinion, and you're really just someone else's proxy. I'm going to shut up and sit back.
No, I think it's interesting. Like, I think, so a couple of thoughts, like, so the question of, one piece that I would say is that I generally am skeptical of arguments where the argument is the crux of the argument is hung on an assumption about someone else's intent. And it's a very natural instinct, but just as sort of a starting point, the education piece that you mentioned and the sort of part about information is so fascinating to me, because especially, and again, the war in the Middle East is an interesting example, but there are lots of examples that you could point to, probably that one included, where if you asked the question and you said, run the thought experiment, if we all had the same information, right? Like, so let's just snap your fingers and we all have the same, from 1947 forward or backwards or wherever you want to go in that, turning the dial on the time machine, like, we all have the same information. Would we then agree? Like, would we then be all on the same page? And right, so Will's shaking his head. And so the answer is obviously no. So there's this piece about it where information is clearly important, but it's not going to be the thing that gets everyone on the same page. And I guess two more things quickly that I just wanted to respond to. One was that, when you're talking, Will, when you're talking about sort of the bad guy and the person and the enemy, the person shooting at you, there's nothing in what I'm saying that, so first of all, yes, obviously, like there's nothing in what I'm saying that says that you wouldn't defend yourself or that you would sit and sort of stare at your navel and try and figure out like the ethics of the situation. Like you would absolutely, you're facing an existential threat, you would absolutely, obviously react. I think there's also a point to be made about if you could, again, like imagine a thought, like there was this case there was a famous Canadian educator, and I'm not remembering the woman's name now, after 9/11, who was she was, I think somewhat of a kind of a peace activist. I wish I could look up her name, but, and she was on a panel, I believe, if I'm getting this right. And the question came up about whether if she had an opportunity to talk to the 9/11 attackers, if she would want to have that conversation. And a lot of the people on the panel sort of the response was, hell no, like, why would I want to even talk to these people? And she was like, yeah, why would I not want to? I mean, I don't remember exactly how she said it, but it was something like, of course. So even the person, not that you want to have a conversation with them when they're pointing a gun at you, but like if you could imagine a thought experiment, there is a version where there is something to be learned there.
Yeah, I think my point there was just again about the practical utility of ethical and moral systems. Like in reality, if Israel were to completely wipe out the population of Gaza, life would probably get better in Israel. So I mean, there's a balance between what you don't want to do as a human who has an honor code that you get used to and which comes to control many aspects of your life. They're probably not going to do that, obviously. And again, sort of how real these rules are. I mean, my comment there was just, of course, soldiers and many other people are going to identify opponents as bad guys, one. And two, that's also probably civically healthy. Two, like in the USA, I think we spend far too much time humanizing our enemies, in fact.
Really?
Condemning our ancestors and talking about the glories of native civilizations and so on. Like, if you're going to have a national mythology, and whether you should at all is very debatable. I have no problem just telling kids the truth once they get to middle school. Everyone in these books was a savage by our standards today. But if you're going to have a national mythology, it makes sense to have a positive rather than a negative one. And I think we've gone too far down the path of sort of hair shirting and beating our own backs with whips, quite frankly. But I mean, so there are two distinct things there. Like, one is human nature, the desire to kill your enemies and destroy their lands. Is that bad? I don't think in any real sense. But two, are your enemies actually these horrific, wicked people? I think your point there is very well taken. Of course they're not. Yeah. I mean, with the question, would you want to talk to the 9/11 hijackers? I'm an American patriot. I'd want to talk to the 9/11 hijackers. I mean, what's the scenario there? Would you be able to potentially prevent 9/11? Would you ask a, vicious but honorable enemy why he did what he did? I mean, I don't see too many scenarios where I would say no to that, honestly. Like the idea that...
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
No, I'm saying I think a lot of people would. Yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of people definitely would. And I think it's important to me to keep duality in your mind. So, I mean, the natives are actually pretty good on this with the concept of the war chief and the rituals they would go through to get ready for war. You switched from the face of the man of peace to the wolf face of war. And then you'd go do these terrible things, and then you'd come back home and your wife would put you through this very painful purification ritual. And then you'd be normal and you'd go back to farming and arguing with her about what was for dinner. I mean, so the idea was that you couldn't behave like that on a day-to-day basis in society. But again, objectively wrong. Like in my opinion, God is not going to judge you for any of this stuff. Much of it is quite socially effective, but it's not behavior that is pro-social in normal society. But I guess the two things I'm saying really don't contradict one another. That said, I would expect that people in most societies deal with these same ethical quandaries. And I think the idea that a colonel level commander for Hamas, for example, would just be an irrationally evil person, consumed by hatred, unable to kiss his wife or talk to his children or something like that. I don't think that's obviously not true. Mm-hmm. It's just difficult for someone who is your enemy to understand you as a person. I would suspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, and again, like, so I would say that, so in my own Euler diagram, I guess, to use Pete's term, like I would say that it comes back to when we have that ability to sort of just condemn, whatever, write off, dismiss. Like this is going back. So this is talking about the book from that'll come out next summer. Like this idea of certainty. I don't like words like always, but I do think that it always can be traced back to some value, principle, belief that you're holding on to as basically inviolable. And I think that that's where I think there are real practical implications for education and for certainly for higher education, but also for, maybe not kindergarten, certainly middle school, high school education, about how we think. And, sorry, just to add one of the things I was saying before when I was talking about what I do, some of these, the idea of certainty has a lot to do, and Will, I don't remember if we've talked about this before, but it has a lot to do with this idea of intellectual humility, right? Or just sort of curiosity. The problem is that as I see it, is that most of us, when it comes to recognizing when we lack, like when it comes to recognizing, oh, you know what, I should be a little bit more humble or a little bit more curious here. Most of us suck at realizing when we lack that. Like we just do. We're not good at it. And sort of by the time you realize that you miss it, that you're lacking that piece, you're sort of halfway there. And so what I'm saying is, no, it's actually that sense that there's, when things are morally clear, you can name why they're morally clear, like, or you can sort of question and challenge your own thinking, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I guess the one thing that I'm getting from that is that I think human beings are very bad at recognizing that our background assumptions aren't ultimate truth. I think that's what gets into a lot of this when we're talking about. Yeah. No, well, thank you. Yeah. But I think that gets into a lot of this when we're talking about like good and evil. Like, I actually don't think that terms like right and wrong are at all useless when it comes to looking at outcomes. Like, I recently looked at the methods for a friend's paper. And for example, having strong rights for women in your country has a bunch of positive outcomes that are practically real because you get half of the population into the workforce and IQ jumps 8 points and so on. So you can say like that is good. I mean, that's just, to me, fairly obvious. But if someone disagrees with that from a radically different society, and I think this is a key point, it's not because they are evil. You're right. It's because they have different starting assumptions in almost every case. Like,
and that's not the same thing, right? And that's not the same thing as saying that they're all. It's not a claim of moral equivalence. You can make that observation without claiming that they're morally equivalent. Sorry, go on.
No, yeah, you can absolutely say that in human terms, the only terms that exist, but not to keep beating this dead horse, but I mean, you can absolutely say that in human terms, rights for women, to the extent those are even negotiable now that we have gunpowder weapons and votes and so on, but they have a positive impact on society because 50% of the population has moved from remaining at home quietly hating you and plotting how to poison you to choosing whether to be housewives or businesswomen or whatever. GDP goes up 47%, whatever she found. I should look this paper up and shout it out. Well, I don't think it's fully through clarity. Yeah. But at any rate, like, obviously you can say that's a positive thing. So you can say that a society that has an advantage is better than other societies. So yeah, it's not amoral relativism, you might call it.
Right, but it's sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, but like, I guess my final sentence is, but criticizing a devout Muslim as evil for not being feminist enough doesn't make sense. There's a whole bunch of starting assumptions that led him or her to that position. And then, by the way, if you look at OnlyFans and that kind of thing, also produce a lot of advantages in his or her society. So, I mean, I think that's where the real point comes up when you talk about things like slavery. Like, was everyone who enslaved battle captives in the past a wicked man? No, because everyone enslaved battle captives in the past. I'd say that's bad, but at the same time, that's one of the most tempting human vices. Like, these guys tried to kill you, they lost, get on that boat. That's what everyone did until very, very recently. So criticizing Westerners for doing this, I mean, you'd also have to criticize Black Africans, Arabs, both of whom were better at trading slaves, by the way, natives who ate their slaves in many cases. So it's fair to say we've made a social advance, but you also have to understand the premises that everyone else was operating from in societies where every adult was a warrior, etc. Evil in the sense of hunting humans for sport is quite rare in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I would just go back to yeah, I think everything that you're saying makes sense. I would just say, I think another way to actually make the point that you just made is that even when you said, women's rights or whatever, or women's access to the labor market or whatever the change is,
Equal
that
social roles and norms.
Sort of changing social roles and norms, that we say we can say that's a good thing because we have somewhere, even though we don't say it out loud, we've defined what good means, right? Like somewhere that good, it doesn't have meaning unless someplace in the back of our mind, we have an idea of what society is supposed to look like. Like it's sort of like the idea of what does progress mean? Like what these things don't have intrinsic meaning on their own, but we can absolutely assign them meaning, right? Like once we define, I mean, it's sort of like, if someone says, let's come up with the best immigration policy, right? Like how am I supposed to know if the best immigration policy is one that is designed to provide refuge for the maximum number of people seeking shelter and refuge from horrible conditions in other countries, right? That's one world. Another version of best immigration policy is that it's supposed to really maximize and optimize the economic interests of people who are already in the host country. Those are going to lead to two really different immigration policies. Will, you look like you're not convinced, but
yeah.
So until and unless we define what best means, we can define it, but like it doesn't really make sense until we don't. And then the one other thing I was going to say about the sort of your example, again, a lot of what in my own work is sort of about how do we disagree. So one example that I've used with students is let's say I'm having a conversation, and it goes well with your example. I'm having a conversation with somebody who doesn't think women should be allowed to drive, and maybe I'm not right. Like, I mean, it's an easy example in this country because there's not many people who think that who would stand behind that. But let's say I'm having a conversation with a person, and I'm not super excited about this point of view, right? Like I'm not on the same page. So one response to that person is, right, like one possible response is, well, you're obviously a raging misogynist, right? Like that's one response. Another possible response is, look, but again, now I've hung my argument on this person's intent. And you could say, well, the fact of their opinion is the evidence of misogyny, but that gets into a whole nother set of assumptions. Another way to disagree would be to say, you know what, I think everyone should have equal rights under the law. Or I think everyone should have the opportunity to pursue their economic potential. And I think driving is an integral part of that. And as long as I'm willing to have that principle questioned, that conversation can keep going. And sort of, Pete, going back to what you were saying, when we run out of words, we start, right? So you want the conversation to keep going. Right, because that person could say, well, you want women to have equal rights under the law. Well, what does that mean? What about the draft? Do you think women should be drafted? I don't know. Like, that's a fair question. Like, as a participant in a democracy, I have an obligation to sort of both acknowledge and reflect on that question.
Yeah. There's a thing in what we're talking about, too, where we project our stuff, our Western stuff, and we're talking about women participating in the workforce and having equal protection. But if you live in the Arghandab Valley of Afghanistan, that does not count. Like that's not a reality that we all share. And so they have to survive in a completely different environment. You were talking about that a little bit. It's inappropriate for us to assign that norm to them. And we've been on this 250-year, I'm pointing to the back of the house here, a journey that we've gotten to this point where we believe that happens because we do have empowered women that have these rights and they've done these things. But we can't know that path will work in this place, and we can't accelerate it reliably. And so we're making this gigantic leap that by creating this thing, these people who are living literally in the Stone Age with no electricity, no roads. I mean, they have some advantage through oil products, but just barely. And so when we go into these other places, I'm using Afghanistan because I know that area, but when we go into these other places and we look and we scoff and we look down on all these things, and we try to design a better future for folks, we haven't got the first clue what it's like to bring that advantage, because we don't know where the advantages are. We don't know the schema or the order that these things have to lock into place where that is even possible. And so we will try to short circuit things that we don't even know what the circuit board looks like. And that's where, again, like this goes back to your work, in that what we think we know and what we actually know is in no way in line with what our I was having this conversation with my buddy Brad, who's probably watching right now. Our ability to understand our rate of mistakes is way out of scope with what our actual rate of mistakes is. Like, our 0th mistake is the fact that we have no idea how many mistakes we make, and it's way in excess of what we, like, we make way more mistakes, and then we get into complex situations like, oh, we're going to go to Afghanistan and fix things. Oh man, we can't comprehend the number of mistakes we are making. It's way outside our ability to actually reliably make something positive happen. Now fix something simple. Oh my gosh, now you're talking about an easy problem compared to go to Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's interesting, like when you talk about the example of, going and bringing sort of Western norms into a non-Western, particularly the example of women or something. I'm not even, I think the argument that you're making is totally fair. I'm not even going that far. Like, I'm actually just saying, like, if you want to make that, if you want to import those norms, understand that there's going to be costs, benefits, advantages, disadvantages, right? And actually totally different from your experience in a lot of ways, but I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 90s in West Africa. And so I have some experience with development work. And I remember thinking, you talked about the circuit board, but I remember when I was in Togo, and I remember thinking that it almost felt like the way international development work was being done was that it was like, you were there were parts of the world that followed this, I don't know if you think of it as linear or whatever, but like this line of progression, right? And then what development work does is you're going in and you're saying, we're going to hop and skip from here to here, and nobody really knows. And it's complicated, right? Because nobody really knows what if that process is important, right? Or if what happens when you skip from here to here. And it's also ethically complicated, because who am I to go in and say that you shouldn't be skipping from here, right? Like, it's just, so I'm more interested in sort of just that we have an honest and open understanding of kind of recognizing that complexity.
Yeah. I think one point that both of you guys are touching on is that the starting assumptions that people have, like when we're talking about those being different in the West and the Islamic world, don't come from nothing. I mean, they come from the sets of experiences that surround people at any given time. So, I mean, I'm assuming that this is a more extreme version of kind of 1990s Latin America or Africa. I've never been to Afghanistan, but if you live in a situation that's basically tribal, you can't go more than 2 villages or towns down the road away from where you are. There were clans, there were tribes beyond the clans, this kind of thing. Saying something like women's rights would help the situation is basically meaningless. There aren't really any men's rights either if you get captured. You're talking about, I'd say more Bronze or Iron Age than Stone Age, but I mean, you're talking about that traditional society. You're basically, a medieval knight or fedayin. You've got a horse, you've got a blade, you might fight with or against the American invaders. So the idea that you're going to transplant in proms and modern women's rights, that doesn't work. And you can still say, well, if everyone were willing to accept that, we know that would be good. I would actually defend this position, by the way. Like, we know that would boost GDP by this amount. Women would be happier. Men would be happier. But the idea is not plausible. It's not theoretically possible. The local leaders, warrior, aristocracy, so on, they're not going to allow that. And it's important. So I wrote this down. It's important to understand this, even when we look at those things that today just seem evil to us, like slavery, for example. I mean, so slavery existed in a world prior to modern machinery and prior to military parole that anyone respected. Those are 2 things that come to my mind immediately. So your farming technology was basically people who were abused to some degree, peasants, serfs, peons, whatever. And you also knew that if you let enemies go, there was no tradition of, respecting the rules of war. They go fight on the other frontier. They're just going to come back and kill you the next year. So generally after a war, you would take all the adult males and you would sell them to somebody. And that probably, you can, whether you view it as right under any circumstances, is how most logical people facing that set of incentives, i.e. next year they're going to kill me if I don't do this, would have responded. And there are many African and Balkan chiefs that have specifically described this, like the process that led them to sell their enemies to these strange looking foreigners on their boats, the big canoes. So, I mean, as those incentives change, as we develop machinery, as we develop rules of war, which date back in the modern sense to, Pete might correct this, but like 1958. I mean, as all those things, parole, as those come into place, you see slavery vanish. The last kind of Arab warrior states got rid of slavery in the 1960s. But prior to that, it's just absurd to say, well, you shouldn't do this. Well, what should I do? Let them kill me next fighting season? There used to be a fighting season. I mean, 5 or 6 months out of the year, as I recall. So, I mean, that's an incentive set that we have trouble recognizing. And the one last one. But when I mentioned Arab friends of mine are very critical of OnlyFans, there are about 3 million sex workers in the United States. The idea that that's a moral challenge is only made possible by modern birth control and so on. Like, being an escort in the contemporary sense, I mean, I've talked with Ella Girl on Twitter earlier this week. You know, you have X number of partners per week. So, I mean, that's just not really plausible if condoms are made out of lambskin and nothing else exists. So even the challenges of today are responses to the technological progress, the moral conversation, so on of today. They'd make no sense to someone from another society who would just ask, why do you have all these prostitutes? I mean, it's a framework that we don't fully understand because we're inside it. But the same goes for the Afghans.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So partly what you were saying made me think of was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like just, you know, where you are in that hierarchy and what concerns when you have your most basic needs met and what you can worry about. You know, your example about slavery. I mean, it's interesting. Like Robert George, you know, the professor at Princeton, like he had this tweet, I guess, that he put out. I don't know if he's put it out in other places as well, but he said at one point where he would ask his students, his class of students at Princeton, and he would ask them, you know, if you were alive in whatever in the 1800s or something, how many of you would have been abolitionists? And they all raised their hands, right? And like, let's assume that we're talking about the white students here. Right. But like, so they all raise their hands and he's kind of like, well, you know, the reality is that's probably not actually, true. Like, we like to think that we would be, right? We all want to think that we would be, but just as a matter of probability, it's not, right? And so like getting people to understand that point, but it's hard. Like yeah, no, because it feels, you know, the sort of morals, there are some moral stains that feel hard to wash off.
I think one follow-up that I would use if I were him, and that I probably will use with my class of students, would just be things about the modern era. I mean, how many of you eat meat, for example? How many of you have an iPhone? Now, I don't have a problem with eating meat. You know, I'm not going to go into my opinion on all these historical atrocities and whether I'm deeply hurt by them. But I mean, I don't have a particular problem with eating meat, so on. But I mean, as we develop lab-grown technology, I mean, I would say that's another thing that's going to fade in popularity. There's not really that much excuse for, you know, having CAFO farms in that context. But I mean, how many of you have an iPhone? Even the OnlyFans example, I don't like the left and right-wing frenzy about pornography, but how many of you watch it 2 or 3 times a week? You know, there's some ethical problems with that industry. You know, so if you brought up the problems of today, how often do you think about nuclear weapons, climate change? You would find that the large majority of people aren't heroes of any kind. They have tons of goods made by child slaves, Nike Air Maxes, and so on. And that's probably a pretty good metric for who would actually have been one of John Brown's resistance fighters back in 1858. I mean, it's a very small minority of people that ignore kind of the lazy pressures of their society to pursue individual moral causes. Sam?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, I mean, what you're positing is that the same people who would, right, sort of who would live the sort of, I don't even know how, I mean, you're saying, I think that the people who take whatever the sort of analog for today, however close you think it can be, find the people that would be living the sort of morally purest, the most pure life that they could, and those are the people that would be the abolitionists, we think, right? Like that would be the best guess. Our best
People are afraid to ask their boss for a raise. Like let's just be honest here. So to actually stand up against society, yeah, come on.
Yeah, but I mean, like you would look at what are today's negative social pressures. Like what percentage of these
that's
college
not the right question. I don't think it's the right question. I think you actually have to get I would say you have to get one step clearer or something, which is it's not just what are today's moral questions. It's what is today's version of a moral question that's going to have the social impact 100 years from now or 200 years from now that slavery did. It's like pick the thing that's going to be that powerful.
Yeah,
I think where people are on it.
Yeah, I think vegans might actually be a pretty close analogy. Yeah. Because if you go back in history, abolitionists were viewed as nutcases. Because remember, all of this stuff, like military parole, farm machinery, all that stuff developed over a period of about 150 years. And prior to that development, I'm almost Marxist with this one. There was just no thought of eliminating slavery. You are not going to let your enemies come back and kill you, and you need to get the crop picked. It just was what it was. Like African leaders, I've read Tipu Tip's autobiography, which is darkly hilarious. You know, I am no bigot. All men are welcome in my markets, either as buyers or merchandise, depending on their fortunes in war. You know, that was just, the whites were at least as brutal. That was just what it was. You know, and the abolitionists at the beginning were people who were essentially saying that the large chunk of society, most of the rich who owned slaves, should give up a substantial percentage of their family fortune and risk death, if you looked at the Haitian example, to make this moral statement. And the moral statement became easier over time, and abolitionism became more and more popular. But I mean, right now, we don't have lab-grown meat yet in any effective form. So you've got a few annoying herbivores that are sitting there chewing on pieces of raw sweet potato and telling you that it's bad to be a predator. And your main reaction is these people are idiots. Morality probably isn't real, and yours certainly isn't. I mean, I'm being kind of blunt about this, but this is the mainstream reaction to this. That is the analogy to abolitionism. And in 200 years, I guarantee you there are going to be people with, you know, fiber optic cable hair, you know, talking to their 3 parents of different sexes around the table and asking how anyone could have eaten meat in the past. It's going to be exactly the same thing. We're going to have
but you're like, there are literally 3 people on this call who none of whom are going to be around to take that bet. So
course,
yes. It's fair enough. Like I think the example of vegan. I mean, it's interesting. But I mean, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I have no idea. It strikes me as it probably depends on how quickly and effectively they can drive down the costs of synthetic meat.
I do enjoy the person who is trying to project being on the right side of history, though. I'm going to be on the right side of history. Like, yeah. That's folly right there. Like, good luck. I've noticed in some of your writing, you've talked about a lot of these things that are within this divide. You know, like President Trump trying to become President Trump again, and our just insanity about all of that, and all of these different things that are just, we force this binary outcome on ourselves. When really, instead of just picking between, like, I love our last several elections, it's like, well, you have to pick the lesser of 2 evils, which is still picking evil. Like, this is the thing that drives me crazy. Why are we so bound to these horrible decisions instead of picking between 2 great options? Man, these are both, it's like cake or pie. Man, I can't decide which one I want. Yeah. They're so good. You know, how do we get ourselves out of these traps? Like, let's stop talking about negative things, and how do we, you know, potentially get to a better place?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, so now you're talking, I mean, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, Pete, like you're talking at some level about who runs for office, right? Like in that election, you're talking about like, well, why do I have to pick between that pile of crap or that pile of crap, or right? Like,
right, we're picking shit either way.
Right. So like, yeah, I mean, I don't, it's an interesting question about how you, like how you create a system that has incentives so that incentivizes people who would be good for the country, good for society, who it's sort of the classic problem that the people who don't want the job are probably the people who you need to do the job, right? Like, and you don't want the people who actually want the job. I don't know how you solve that problem. I don't know. Will, what do you think? I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, I think that So yeah, I actually agree with you that there's a problem with incentives for these kind of psychopath favoring jobs. I mean,
Mhm.
where you don't pay people an
Or
extraordinary
narcissism.
amount of
Yeah.
money, you
Yeah.
give them very significant power. You know that, I mean, it's like the old poem, and he who rises high, they rise to drag him down. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. Like, you know, you're going to make all these enemies. It's a tough question. And as a result, democratic options are often crap. I have a friend in India who teases me about how we need a king. He's an Indian monarchist, but I mean, like, he actually texted me pictures of Trump and Biden the other day and was like, these are the options. So, I'm starting to maybe come around to his point of view a little. What could we do about that? I mean, you could put more regulations on the process. Like, we hear a lot about how more people need to vote, felons,
Oh, ranked
and
order voting, like, yeah, in the primaries. Yeah.
I kind of disagree. I mean, I think you should be forced to identify the parties and the candidates or something at least in order to be able to vote. I wouldn't object to restrictions on the candidates, an age cap or a competency test cap for individuals who want to run for office, that kind of thing. I don't think either Trump or Biden would necessarily get through any kind of rigorous screening process.
Mhm.
And I mean, in Trump's case, at least half the country thinks he tried to take it over. It seems like that could be, a disqualifier. They're both involved in these legal cases, although Biden through his son. I haven't really given any solutions here. I would tighten up the process to become a candidate, and I would provide more empirical reward, at least if you're talking about things like state legislature and Congress. I
Yeah.
mean, more pay, that sort of thing. And I think then you'd get a better pipeline going up. But
Yeah.
last comment, a lot of this just gets down to the primary process in the USA, right? I mean, we've got a system that's very rigged against third parties, and then we don't allow ranked choice voting, so we could never do anything like what the Euros do.
That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and then, I mean, what is it? One of you guys might correct this, but it's like 8-9% of the country votes in each early partisan primary. So you're incentivized to produce. I mean, how would you respond to that? Open primaries, like ranked choice. Now, this is where you actually get into options. Actually, this is much more productive. But right now, that's how you get like the AOCs and the MTGs. You get like people that remind me of people my friends have gone out with. I mean, like Lauren Boebert. They're just normal citizens or like business owners that party that are like, yeah, I could do that. I could get 11,000 votes in East Left Foot County, and they run for office, and then they become quite prominent. I mean, so I would crack down on that a little more requirements to become a candidate, but also regulate that extremely partisan primary process, so on, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have an answer to it. I can say, I mean, if we sort of go back to where we started, the conversation that we have about how to solve that problem is that's an important conversation. And this is what we've hitched our wagon to, for better or for worse, by wanting to have a representative democracy. And so, which I still think, again, for all of its flaws, is probably, I don't know. I mean, yeah, obviously people make an argument that what we should have is a monarchy and what we need is a king, or what we need is a benevolent dictator, or whatever. Like, I tend to still think that democracy, for all its flaws, and sort of like capitalism, is sort of the best, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. And so, I don't know, figuring that.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I just I wrote a funny email in this group that I'm in, and we were talking about the Lagrange points out in space. And I said, I'm pro developing these things, and I'm going to go to if I'm president, I go to the truck stop companies, Flying J, Love's, Bucky's, and we develop that thing so that Americans can go whatever the fuck they want and buy shit with Elvis on it, knives, and just, Americanize space and just go crazy. I don't know. I mean, we just saw the president of Harvard try to hang on to her job and lose it because Chris Rufo said, you made shit up. You stole someone else's work. Not because she was openly anti-Semitic or didn't back off an anti-Semitic position. And she didn't have a job because she was this world-class scholar. And it's like this is our number one institution, So if we have problems at this level and we can't pick good presidents, well, then we got what's coming. If we can't figure out how to do that, it's a bigger and different problem, I think. Yeah, I mean, I've offered, by the way, to be the president of Harvard interim.
Okay, very nice, very nice. We'll with all my multiple connections, we'll just make that happen.
Yes.
I have a hard time.
Yeah,
I'll be honest. Like when it comes to Claudine Gay, I have a little bit of a hard time separating the particulars of this situation from the broader, like the broader own goal of what higher education has done to itself, and the broader just complete breakdown of a national political conversation. Like, and so in some ways I can see the specifics of her case, and I haven't followed it super closely. And in some ways I'm just like, she's like collateral damage in this mess that we've never figured out, like about identity, about whatever, about all of these other, and there's so many different pieces to it.
Yeah.
Which is not to say,
but we're doing this to ourselves.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think and particularly in higher education, I would say we're doing it to ourselves, and it's totally unnecessary. Like it's totally unnecessary. Like one of the biggest things I think, and that what higher education would do well, if we would do a lot better if we did, was start to make contact with the fact that you can't be all things to all people. Like you cannot have a campus environment where you're prioritizing simultaneously academic freedom or open inquiry or whatever you want to call it, and making people feel safe, not offended, whatever. Like at some point these things are going to, and they are and have run into one another, and higher education has just been repeatedly sort of unwilling to acknowledge the conflict and to sort of tackle it head on, but it's just rearing its head in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. My thing about the Claudine Gay situation is that it actually reveals how much we have two different perspectives on the world in the USA right now. Yeah. So there are a substantial number of people, including a lot of intelligent minority executives I know, that genuinely believe that like Claudine Gay was overqualified for that job. It is harder to get admitted to or hired at a Research One university if you were Black, and that the reason Claudine Gay was attacked is because of racism. And I mean, I have some sympathy for this narrative because I've read about the 40s and 50s in the U.S. South and all that. Although I wasn't born until 1981, but I think the objective reality is that right now, every institution where I've ever been a leader, business, academic, whatever, one of their top 5 goals is diversity. It's not as large a boost as is sometimes suggested, but there's about 100-point affirmative action plus for Black and Hispanic applicants. You see similar things in the hiring pipeline. We all know this. The reason that Gay is in trouble is that she put herself in a very controversial arena. Of course, her opponents are conservatives, but right now they're on 51 documented instances of plagiarism. So, from this perspective, I kind of feel sorry for her because I honestly think that anyone who gets on the big stage like this and pisses off a power group, which could be Blacks as easily as whites, liberals as easily as conservatives, we've seen it in both directions, you're going to get attacked and you have about a 50% chance of survival. So I don't really have any hatred for the fact that she's going back into political science, where she's considered fairly solid. But the reality that she did what she's accused of is there. You can read it. So I think that there are these two different perspectives. One is, okay, it's a power game. She got caught, send her back to her old job. And 2 is like yet another instance of the satanic racism it's hard for me to take number 2 seriously, but a lot of people have been taught in number 2 their entire life. There's systemic racism in these institutions. And now we see it. This was the first Black president. They wouldn't let her hold that job. And ignored in all this is the fact the main person she ripped off, Carol Swain, is a Black former university professor and executive. So complex world.
Well, frankly, it sounds like you are far more informed on the topic than I am. I'm more sort of watching it from a distance and saying there's a way to, so everything that you're saying makes sense. There's a way to view it again, and I haven't been following it as closely. There's a way to view it that because of all this stuff, if you just take a few more steps back, because of the complete failure and breakdown around the sort of conversation in higher education about the Israeli-Gaza war, that breakdown comes is sort of our own goal in higher education about our complete, which goes back to our complete inability to sort of not be binary thinkers, to see complexity, to be clear, to be clear in our values, all of those things. And then there's a way to view her that it's sort of like she was the very high profile example of everything that was going on wrong in October, November, et cetera, and then come with these hearings in higher education. And so she was coming down regardless, right? Like someone was, it's what you just said before, like you get, however you said it, like you get high enough. And so there's a little bit of, it to me of like a pitchforks and torches feeling. And I don't like pitchforks and torches regardless of who is wielding them. And that may be unfair because I will be the first person to admit that, again, like you seem to be far more knowledgeable on this, the particulars of Claudine Gay, than I am. I'm just saying from my minimal knowledge perspective, standing back, it has a little bit of that feeling.
Oh yeah, I mean, so a lot of this is fairly partisan. Like I know and like Chris Rufo, but I mean, had Claudine Gay been what's a top 100 conservative college, Hillsdale? I mean, had Claudine Gay been the conservative president of a university who said the same thing, like we've got free speech rules here, you can like it or dislike it, there's some exceptions for gender, but no, we don't expel students for that. I don't think there really would have been that much of a crisis. I mean, Gay happened to be the very woke president of Harvard. Harvard just got sued in fair admissions. I mean, she kind of had to know what this was, to use that phrase again, when she gets in there and there's a Republican congressman asking, like, do you support genocide? But I mean, she then handled it quite badly. And in fact, most of them, of the 3 or 4 presidents that were in that room, at least 2 have been fired. I mean, the president of Penn was fired
Harvard,
a day.
right?
A day after the hearings. I mean, and again, there's just a practical reason. A conservative donor withdrew a $120 million gift.
Yeah.
And that was it. I mean, if you're, people are pretty open about that.
Yeah.
So unfortunate.
Was that one at Harvard? That was at Harvard or Penn?
That was at Penn. So it was 3 presidents in the main room. The only one that has not been attacked is the president of MIT.
Oh, interesting.
And you kind of wonder why that is. I don't know.
Why do you think?
I have no idea. I mean, now one thing I will say, and I'm not saying this is a primary cause, but she's Jewish and, as I understand, fairly faithful. And I mean, if that's wrong, I'll look it up after the show. But I think it would be a little harder to accuse her of being a crazy anti-Semite. I mean, she's at an institution with a large percentage of Jewish American students, and she's Jewish. Mm-hmm. So I think that might have given kind of the trio, who all get along pretty well, a little better of a line of defense. Like, you're calling us anti-Semites, but we're all women, 2 of us are minorities, and I'm Jewish. So I think they just focused on, they took out the weak link first, and then the white woman who had no one to go to bat for, and then they went after Gay. And
but even then, like, so everything you're saying, again, like, of course it makes sense. You are telling us, like, you're seeing what happened, and you're telling a story about what happened, right? Like, and maybe it's right, but I have no idea. Like, sure,
that would be my guess. I actually, I meditate fairly often, and there's a sort of exercise I do where you sort of roll dice in your head and see probabilities, which sounds silly, but actually works quite well. And I'd put what I just said at about 55%. I wouldn't have made the strategic decision to attack a pro-Israel Jewish American about being an anti-Semite. So you just have to sit her outside the conversation. Say something like, well, one of these presidents is quite well qualified, and we'll let her get a pass on her unfortunate remarks once. And then you'd go after the other 2 that you thought you could more easily attack. And the strategic nature of this is one reason it irritates a lot of people. Like, again, I like a lot of the people involved. Sibarium's a good reporter. But, like, is the only motivation in this kind of competition sincere outrage about plagiarism? I mean, no, I compete. I can't imagine that it is. There's also a desire to get that trophy, to show that the president of Harvard is kind of unqualified, knock her off the board and see what happens. Can you get an ally in that role? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's on 6. That's on 6.
Well,
yeah.
Well, this has been fantastic. I don't want to keep you guys for too long. Is there anything either of you wants to say in closing before we wrap it up?
No, thanks, Pete, so much and Will. This has been really a great conversation. I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Yeah. And everybody should, if you guys go to the website over here, down in the corner, that's her website, and everything's in there. You can go to her Substack and subscribe over there and just, check it out and get the book.
Spend no money.
When does the book come out?
The the book comes out. The date is September 2nd, but there's actually, I stuck a form on my website if anyone wants to be notified when it's available for pre-order.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah, that's on there too. But yeah, it should be out September 2nd.
Yeah, I think then when you're ready, come back and let's talk about it again, because all this stuff goes, we could have this whole conversation again and it would be all new topic.
I'm gonna go off the call and draw an Euler diagram.
Yeah, good. I love it. I love it. I'm advocating for Euler, even though he's been dead for 250 years. I'm always advocating
I love
for
the
Euler.
idea. Like,
let me run.
Yeah,
let me run this thing. Hang on. Stand by, you guys, and I'll say bye to you in a second. Hold on. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much